Okay, for bread, girls, you need 250 grams of strong plain bread flour. It needs to be strong flour because strong flour contains more gluten than ordinary flour. Gluten is the protein found in bread and it's what makes it stretchy. So if you imagine having a bread roll in your hands and snapping it in half, it kind of is a bit elasticy. If you imagine having a cupcake and snapping that in half, it's a bit crumblier, or a scone, it's a bit crumblier. And the bread has that texture because of the gluten in the flour. So you need to make sure you've got your 250 grams of strong plain flour measured out into a bowl. You're going to add to that 1 teaspoon of yeast. And then you're going to add to that half a teaspoon of salt, and half a teaspoon of sugar. Once you've got those basic ingredients in a bowl, you need to measure out 175 millilitres of lukewarm water. Now, the best way to describe lukewarm water is that it's not hot and it's not cold. If you dipped your little pinky into it, you kind of wouldn't feel a lot. It would just feel almost like skin temperature. And into the water, I'm supposed to add a tablespoon of oil. I'm not going to measure that out. You may wish to. I know that's about a tablespoon. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to carefully mix all of this in together to make a soft dough. Now, if you add all of your liquid in at the same time, then you might end up with dough that's far too wet. So do it a bit at a time. You're aiming for something which is not sticky, but that is not too hard. It needs to be really quite soft. And if anything, it's almost better to err on the side of slightly stickier than hard for bread dough, which is exactly the opposite to if you were making something like pastry when you really wouldn't want sticky. So that's all of my water in. Actually, that looks pretty good. If you find that once you've added all of your liquid, it's still not all come together like this has here, then just add another splash more of water. Flours are all fairly different and they will absorb different amounts of liquid, but that looks fairly good. So I'm going to get rid of that excess dough from my wooden spoon, and then I'm going to turn my dough out onto my board, which I've floured. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to knead the bread dough. Don't add too much flour to your board, because whatever flour you have on your board, the bread dough will absorb, and therefore it will lose its softness and become hard quite quickly. But at the same time, you do need some flour on there, otherwise it is likely just to stick. The whole aim of kneading is to stretch the gluten strands in the flour. So you need to visualise this as you're doing it. You're stretching this dough. And once we start, we're going to continue for between 5 and 10 minutes. So what you do is you use your fingertips to bring the dough over and fold it over, and then use the heel of your hand to push the dough out. You see how that's stretched the dough? And then I'm going to turn it a little bit so that I'm working on a slightly different area of the bread. Fingertips over, heel of the hand to push it out. Turn it. Fingertips over, so it's almost like a calzone pizza. Heel of the hand to push it out. Turn. And what will happen is, as you get the hang of doing it, you'll be able to start to do this faster and faster, so it almost becomes one movement. So I'm left-handed, I'm using my left hand to knead, and I'm using my right hand to turn my dough. And you then start to get really quite quick at doing it. Still slightly sticky on the top there, which is why I keep sprinkling more flour on. Okay, fingertips over, heel out, turn, over, out, turn. And you are going to continue doing this for a good 5 minutes. So I've been kneading this for 10 minutes and now I'm ready to move on to the next stage. Now, if we had a long time, then to make really lovely bread, the best thing to do with this now is to put it into a clean bowl, cover it with a tea towel, leave it in a nice warm place and wait for it to rise so that it's doubled in size, which takes about an hour. If you want to do that, that's great, do that, and then once an hour is up and it's doubled in size, what you do is you knead it again for another couple of minutes. That's called knocking it back, and that gets rid of any air bubbles that have formed whilst the bread has been doubling in size, and that's called proving the bread. We're not going to do that today because in lessons we sometimes don't have time to do that, so I show you the quick way of making bread. If you want to prove it, that's fine, and then you'll get to this stage after an hour. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this bread now into 4 pieces, and I'm going to make 4 bread rolls. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to try and make them into a nice round shape by just pulling in little bits of bread dough into the centre like that. And then once I've done that, if I turn the bread over, that forms a lovely round bread roll. Okay, I'm just going to quickly do that for all 4 rolls. Okay, so I've made the 4 bread rolls now, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to leave those on top of my cooker, and I'm going to cover them in a tea towel, and I'm going to leave them for probably 3/4 of an hour to an hour until again they've doubled in size, and at that point I'm going to bake them in a hot oven, 200 degrees centigrade, gas mark 6, for about 15 minutes. Okay, the bread rolls have been proving now and they're ready to go to the oven. Okay, these bread rolls have been in the oven for 15 minutes. All I need to do now is check that they're cooked, so I'm going to tap the base of each bread roll. If it sounds hollow, that means it's cooked. I think that sounds pretty hollow. So those bread rolls are all ready now and will taste delicious, I'm sure.